Look at that. Look at that. Okay. Um, this is a particularly interesting one for me for a number of reasons. As we start to try to find a way to continue to build this club, work on the website, look at the programs, look at the projects, look at the things we're doing. It's nice to see some of the young guys, be they retired or not, come along and move through the hobby fairly quickly and leave a bit of a trail as they go through. And Don Paluga, call as KQ4PCR, right?
Roger.
Okay, all right. And he retired last year and decided to get, as a result of having some radio background, to get into ham radio. He's gone through all 3 license steps, so he's an extra. And the interesting part about it is that if you look at what's happened, he's basically come through all 3 of those and amassed a Heathkit vintage station. And what you don't know is part of his stations at my house, I've got an amplifier he's got his hooks into. So he's got almost a whole station, but it's a lovely station. He's focused primarily on DX and POTA so far. And I think what you're going to see tonight is the fun he's having with ham radio through the last year. And I'll let him tell the rest of the story. I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks, Lee. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for coming. Bear with me. In a few minutes, I'll get my feet under me. It's like a pile-up. I'll have to work my way into it. I'm going to talk about my first year. And as he said, I'm Don Paluga, KQ4 PCR. And so the first, I want to start out, with a little bit of my background. You heard some of it, but the first thing, if you look at one of the bullet points, just a dot there about, the bullet point, that little small circle. So that to me represents what I've learned about ham radio. And then that whole slide is everything I don't know about ham radio. So, I've just touched the surface, scratched it. And even though I think I've learned quite a bit, I know there's so much more that I don't know. And that's what's exciting about it to me, that all those places I still got to go, all the mistakes I'm going to make, going forward. But as Lee said, I'm retired from the construction industry. I was looking for something to keep my mind active. My uncle was a ham. So I remember that, from my childhood growing up. Of course, I went through the CB phase like we all did in the 70s, or not all of us, but people of my age in the 70s went through the CB stage. So we messed around with that, but I never really lost the allure of the long distance communication, listening to my uncle talk to somebody in Africa or Italy or something like that. Man, I just thought that was really, really cool. So that's kind of what, when I was looking for something to hook my, sink my teeth into, that was, in the back of my mind, So I said, I'm going to investigate, ham radio, see if I, what I can do, what I can find out. And, so I'm going to talk about the ARRL a little bit. I know that's kind of a touchy thing. Some people like ARRL, some people don't like the ARRL. But I'm telling you that if it wasn't for the ARRL, I probably wouldn't be here. I mean, I got a lot of information from that website on how to get my license, how to find a club, what forms I need to fill out, study materials, books, reference materials. So, everybody does their own thing, but, I'm kind of a believer, in this organization. And they were instrumental in bringing me, into the hobby. I could have jump back and hit, a couple of those links are live, and if you go back to this presentation later, you can go back and click on those. They'll take you to the websites, they'll take you to the licensing part, and they'll take you to some of that, but I don't think there may be a few in here that I'll hit, and while we're talking, But if you want to go back and look at this later, the links hopefully in the presentation will still be live when you go looking at it. But the other thing that the AARL had was, the club section. And, through that, I was thinking, well, I found out, they said, find a club, look for some classes, because I had, I knew that I needed to, pass a test for the tech, pass a test for the general, and extra as I progressed. And, but I needed a way to learn. And I learn a lot by, and retain a lot by reading, but visual learning is important to me too, and everybody learns a little different. But through the AARL, I found the Chattahoochee Radio Club, and they were having actually, a technician's class. It just happened that, the next week starting, when I was looking, and I said, well, bingo, So, I went out to the American Legion Hall in Powder Springs, and there's a group of about 5 folks in there. And, it was a one weekend for each weekend for a month. And went through 4 or 5 lessons, went back, took the AAR manual, read them, took this practice test, went back the next week, whichever. And then on the 4th weekend, we took the exam, passed the exam, and I got my technician's license on February 27th and 25, so KQ4 PCR, was born, on February 27th. My objective was always HF. I mean, like I said in the beginning, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make contacts all over the world. At first I wasn't interested in 2 meters and 70 centimeters. That came into my career a little bit, my little journey a little bit later. But I was DX. And I even told the guys when I was taking the test for the technicians, so I'm going to get on DX. And they all looked at me like, and I said, hey, we've got 28.3 to 28.5 on 10 meters. I got HF. And this was in February of last year, so y'all know, man, 10 meters was on fire in February of last year. So, I jumped in there and, I just, went to town. I knew I wanted to do this, but I was still had a little trepidation. So, I was looking for radios, and you read a lot, buy your last radio first. It's the same thing like buying your last RV first. Who knows what your last RV or your last car is going to be or whatever. So I went a little light, did some research, looked around, and Radio Oddity had this thing called a QT60, a little 60-watt single sideband radio. Very inexpensive. Actually put out a little more than 60 watts. It was probably, but it was a nice little radio, and it was inexpensive. And then I said, well, I need an antenna, so, from my CB days, I was thinking ham sticks, So I got a 10-meter ham stick. I got a 16-inch lawn spike and a mirror mount, and hooked that ham stick up, from the instructions, measured the stinger out to get me kind of in place. I had no measurements, I just wanted to get it kind of right. And then I made 4 9-foot 3-inch radials and jammed that thing in the backyard, and bingo, I was on the air. And, it was easy to deploy and simple and got me started. So, my first shack was my patio table on my deck in my backyard, with a little POTA cable. You see it sheathed in yellow, running out, to my 10-meter vertical antenna, my ham stick jammed in the ground out there, And with that little booger there, got 34 DX entities in my first 30 days, 107 contacts, on that, that little slice of 10 meters, so it, it was just, really, really, really a lot of fun. And this was, easy for me to do because, I still didn't know really what I wanted to do and how I was going to approach it. And this just, gave me a pretty good, approach. My first HF contact was I was camping in Mexico Beach, down in the Gulf of Mexico. And, I got this guy, fella named, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but, K1OIK in Massachusetts. And, we talked. I made a few mistakes. I fumbled around a little bit. He helped me, said, you should do this, say this. This is what is typical. If you don't know what to say, try these things. Start with, your location, what your working conditions are. Simple things about how to, the little canned QSO things until you get comfortable being on the air. So he worked with me, a little bit, and I really appreciated that. And then, like I said, in that next 30 days, I made those DX contacts and 105, other contacts as I went along. Either in the, in the backyard or on the beach somewhere when I was camping. Because my setup, threw it in a box and it went wherever I was. I was portable and, didn't really even realize what I was doing. At that time, I also discovered POTA, and that was really cool because the POTA, I don't know if that's me dinging or what, but am I doing something wrong? But so, I saw the POTA website, went there, and, and found their spotting page. And, so I would look for POTA stations that were working in that, 28.3, 28.5 range. And, and started making contacts that way to, and started getting used to working on the radio. It was, and, I was just having a ball. So I continued playing on 10 meters through March, but, I was hooked by this time, so I knew I needed to make the next step and I wanted to go ahead and do the general. So, I purchased the next double R manual, the general, started going, Chattahoochee had a general. The next month, they were running general classes. So I went back. I had a couple of the same guys from my tech class, so that was kind of neat. I was kind of, building some camaraderie with other individuals that were being licensed at the same time with me, and I hoped would grow through their, careers, with me. That didn't happen. People drift and change hobbies, but, whatever. But it was nice at least to have that camaraderie while, I was taking the test. So we did that same thing, worked for a month, Saturday, take the test on the last day of the month, and I probably got a little ahead of myself because, I had my eye on my next radio already. So I was going to say, well, I need more bands, so I had to do something. So I'm looking back and forth, and, obviously everybody knows there's super good, relatively inexpensive radios for people to start with these days. The two of the ones that I kind of looked at were the IC 7300 and then the FT 710. And I could have gone, either way with those. And it just so happened that the 710 went on sale. So, I didn't know much, I wasn't an ICOM guy, I wasn't a Yaesu guy, Yaesu guys, saying this is better, ICOM guys saying the Yaesu menu sucks, you get it, you gotta kind of pick your poison. And, but anyway, the Yaesu went on sale, so that was good enough for me. So I ordered it that Friday. I knew I was taking my test on Saturday. Went and took my test, and it got delivered Saturday afternoon. And luckily, I had my little /AG when I came home and opened that box. So that Saturday afternoon, I got to cut open that box and go out on my shack. I still got the little plastic on the screen there. This puppy's right out of the box. So I got my FT 710, and I back up one, and I had upgraded my antenna. So let me see if I can there it is. So I've gone from now my little vertical to a dipole, man. Now I've got my 10-meter dipole ham sticks. So and I was figuring, well, I got to get a mast, I got to do something. And, I'm walking through the garage and I see my old antenna trimming pole. That's it. Took the saw off the end of that, went out in the backyard, zip tied it to the fence. I bolted that dipole mount, with the 10-meter dipoles, and I had bought 20-meter ham sticks and 40-meter ham sticks. So I was multi-band with a rotatable dipole, on my throwaway tree trimming pole, So I thought I was in high cotton, but I was having fun, and that was the big thing about it for me was just having a blast. And, this worked for me for a while because, I was just getting started. And I could take it down because I had to come in at night. I couldn't leave the radio out there on the patio, So I had to roll everything up at night and go back in the house, and I just lowered this and disconnected that's ABI Industries POTA cable. Some of y'all do POTA recognize it with the yellow sheathing on it, so people don't trip over it. So I just roll that up and lower the dipole, line it up with the fence so nobody would trip on, hit it when they walk by, and bring my radio inside and start again the next time I wanted to play. But that wasn't, obviously wasn't, gonna last long. But, so, my wife and I travel a lot, and the whole idea of this, like I said, was to be portable. So you take the 710, put it in the truck. I've got my rotatable dipole zip tied to the picnic table, and sitting there on the beach in East Point, Florida. That's Apalachicola Bay out there, and talking all day down to the islands. Which began my love affair with DX in the islands. I love talking to the folks in the islands. But this, I wanted to be a little more nimble, and I wanted 80 meters, and I wanted the Workmans. I wanted 15, so I knew I had to make a change, so, and this is where, for a new person, this is a pretty sticky wicket. You got, which way do you go? I mean, obviously I'm not going to, spend $5,000 on a tower and a tri-bander with a rotator. I mean, I'm not anywhere near that yet. Wouldn't even know what to do with it if I had it, okay? So, I know I'm going to go with a wire, and I'm doing the research on off-center fed, on dipoles, in-fed half waves. And to me, what it came down to was which was the easiest to deploy in my field conditions, where my shack was going to be in relation to the objects that I could string the wire to. So to me, that was, what lended me towards the in-fed half wave. And, and to solidify my decision was I was, just calling CQ on 10, from the ports one day, and a gentleman answered my call, a fellow named Scott, KD4MSR. He's a member of the Atlanta Radio Club. But he got me ground wave on 10 meters because he was just literally about 1.5 miles from me as the crow flies, just on another ridge. I live on one ridge, there's a ravine, he lives on the other ridge. So, we dropped it down to about 5 watts, and we were talking. And, I explained my situation, and he said, he said, yeah, it sounds like, simplest way to get you up and running is the in-fed half wave. So, he recommended something inexpensive. So, I picked up this MFJ 1982 MP, which is their mid-power in-fed half wave. I think it was probably $60 at that time, something like that. And, but he not only recommended that, he and a friend of his came over to my shack and helped me put it up. He had a slingshot, with the weights, we got it up in the trees, got it up, helped me tune it a little bit, so, I consider, Scott one of my first ham heroes, a fellow that helped me in my journey. So this was, it was a big upgrade from my little dipole, push-up thing. But, I still use that dipole, because it slides in the camper, and I use it at campsites all the time. It still functions well. But my mistake here is where I started making mistakes. I didn't know it at the time. This had a 300-watt rated on it, 49 to 1. I had not, I'll never need an amplifier. I mean, we'll probably all go in there and say, and a lot of people still don't. Because, I had already hit an awful lot of places with 100 watts in a wire anyway. I mean, I had already got Canada, I had Australia, I had New Zealand, I had Seychelles, I had American Samoa, so I was making it, with 100 watts. But in the pileups, I had to outthink or outmaneuver or I like to, maybe out-operate some of the other folks. Listening to the cadence of how they were calling CQ, how they were replying, when they were picking, how they were doing what. So I got my way with my little 100 watts in, by paying attention, listening, and then diving in at the opportune moment where I had the best chance to make a contact. And that worked, for quite a ways. The antenna is in a north-south orientation. The feed point at one end is 8 feet off the ground, an inverted V up to 45 feet, and then 10 feet on the other side. And then that southernmost tree is only 40 feet from the entrance to my ham shack. So I've got a 50-foot run of LMR 400. At that time, it was just RG8X. 50-foot run of RG8X into the shack. So like I said, the infed was just perfect, for my particular situation. So that was working fine. I'm starting to make contacts, and I got to keep track of everything. So my next find was QRZ, and everybody probably in here knows about QRZ. And I love QRZ. I like being able to pull people up and look at their profile page if they remember when I'm talking to them. They can pull me up. They can see what I've got. And if you are doing long QSOs, as I say, like when I'm calling CQ, I'm not always trying to just make contacts. I'm looking to talk to people in different places. That QRZ page is a conversation starter for me, and I imagine other people too. You can look at the QRZ page. Oh, you ride a motorcycle? Yeah, I ride a motorcycle. Oh, you camp a lot? Yeah, I camp a lot. Oh man, you've got a FT710, same radio I got. So it helps with the conversation, and so it's I used it to research the people I was talking to, but I also used it as my really logging software. Although I don't think it's really what its initial and primary focus is. I think it's really more a confirmation platform than a logging software platform, but I used it for both. And it functioned for me for quite a while. So I'm up and running, trucking along, and I'm thinking, well, I really enjoyed working and meeting some of the fellows at the KRC, but I went to one of their meetings, and it just wasn't the right fit. I didn't feel comfortable. There's nothing wrong, just different people, different mixes. So I went around and had seen the North Fulton, on the ARRL Club Finder too. So I started doing a little research there, and then also it's about this time I said I wanted to go ahead and get into 2 meters and 70 centimeters. I didn't have a 2 meter or 70 centimeter radio. Most people, that's the first thing they get. It's a handheld. My first radio was that QT60, so I had never done any 2 meter. So Scott from the Atlanta Radio Club took me to a tailgate over towards Stone Mountain, and a gentleman was selling a couple of 8-watt handheld radios, antennas, chargers. He was getting out of the hobby, and so I picked up a couple of handhelds for $20, and I learned how to operate them, learned how to program repeaters. And I started listening for active repeaters, and I found, the Narfel machine, the 145-470 repeater. Started talking to people on the repeater, heard about Hungry Hams, came to lunch at the Hungry Hams on Wednesdays at Slopes, met most of y'all there at one point in time or another, and then, started coming to some meetings, and felt comfortable. It was a really nice group, a welcoming group, at Hungry Hams. So I said, I think this is, a place where I'll probably try to hang my hat. But what was great about that was, I was starting to make contacts with people that I could see. The long distance contacts were cool, and I was, there are still some people that I talk to on a monthly basis, in different countries. But it's nice to, pick up the repeater when you're driving around town and talk to, K4 USA or WA1 NIP or KQ4 OSG or, any one of the number of you guys. I mean, and then see them at lunch the next day. So, that was, 2 meters to me was a way to make local contacts. So to wrap this part up, but, a good club is really important, I think, it was important in my career, and I would think it would be important on everybody's ham radio journey. Because a club where you feel comfortable and a club that's active, they'll supercharge, your career. They'll challenge you a little bit, and introduce you to new things. You're just sitting around a table listening to it at lunch, hearing things I had no idea what the hell they meant, So I think, a club will push you, to expand your knowledge base, but here I think is where a lot of people fall off, new hams. All those people I tested with in the tech class and the general class, there's only 2 of them that are still active, which is a real shame. The investment they put in, and then they didn't. They bought an HT, they couldn't hit a repeater, didn't know how to program a repeater, couldn't make any contacts, got frustrated and left. So whenever we see these guys or hear them on the repeater and they're stumbling around, don't blow them off. Talk to them, invite them to a meeting, invite them to field day. Ask them what they've got. See if you can't help them. We can come to their rescue here. This right here. That 8-watt. That's a $10, because I bought 2 of them for $20, right? Okay, there's my mobile rig, okay? It's about as fancy as my 10-meter vertical, right? That is running out through the door jam, I did get a decent antenna. I got an SSB 5, Comet, which is a quarter wave dual band antenna. So with that and this 8 watts, I can hit all the repeaters. I didn't have any problem. That's what some of these new people are missing. They got the little rubber duck antenna and they can't do anything with it. Help them get something like this. There's $10. If you got an old antenna, 2-meter antenna sitting around, give them a dang antenna. And then for $15, $20, you can get them to where they can hit a repeater. They can make some contacts. Maybe they'll go to lunch. Join the club and get their general. So this is, I think, something that's really, really important. And I got over that hurdle. And this is where I see a lot of people fall off. So the next thing would be mic fright. Okay? I thought I was cool. I thought I had it all knocked. I'm, making contacts, but I had never really called CQ. I was replying. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and call CQ, but no, I wasn't. I'm just going to call CQDX. Okay. So I'm out there, and I had talked to a few people and heard a few things, and one thing stuck in my mind was when you're going to call CQ, at least go about 15 seconds or longer. Say your call sign a couple of times, obviously slowly and phonetically. But if you give your QTH, then if they've got a beam, they can swing towards you. If you're going for 15, 20 seconds, they're going to see you on their waterfall. So you're more apt to get some contacts than just go CQ, CQ, DX, KQ4, PCR, and gone. You blipped on the waterfall, and they aren't even going to notice you. So if you're a little bit longer and you give them a direction, if they're swinging a beam, I found that helped, in making contacts. So one evening I'm calling CQ, and I got my first reply. And of course, I froze. So what the hell do I do now? So I stumbled around a little bit, and I made it through. Got my call sign, got his call sign, logged it in. And then all of a sudden, I call again, another guy answers, and I call again, another guy answers. Then all of a sudden, it's like, this, that, the other. All of a sudden, man, I had a pileup. I had heard the term, but this is my first pileup. I'm going, whoa, okay? Now I'm sitting there scribbling, trying to get partial calls, telling people to hold, all the stuff that I had, seen but never experienced, and I butchered the hell out of it. But it was, I was having fun, and I got through that. And so I gained a whole lot of experience that night and had a heck of a lot of fun. And then I made the hot DX on QRZ and that's where all my I thought that was, whoa, man, that was pretty cool. So this is like 4 months into my ham radio career, so I was rocking, I was having fun. And then, so the next big thing in my career or my journey was field day. And, so that was coming right up there, summer of 2024. I knew what field day was, from, online and from the QST magazines. And, talking about it at the lunch and listening to the guys talk about it at the Hungry Hams. And, at one of the meetings, the GOTA station came up. And the guy goes, hey, you're a newly licensed ham, you're eligible to work on that. And I said, oh, yeah, that sounds like fun. So, it came and went, and, went to the GOTA tent and, started making call. And John, KQ4OSG, one of my other ham friends that I've met over in this last year, he met me over at field day. We had talked about going together, meeting over there. And he wound up working a slot with me. We worked a couple of 1-hour slots together. He'd call, I'd log, I called, he logged. And we got into a groove, and we had a blast. And it was just, and I think that helped kind of cement a little bit of a friendship, in that little, I wouldn't, trial by fire sounds a little dramatic, but that situation that we were in, that learning experience, helped solidify, that friendship. He got his tech and general tickets within a few days of me, and so he's been progressing through his career, at the same time as I have, and I think that's also important for a new ham. If you can connect with somebody that's in the same point of their journey as you are, then you can share those experiences, as a contemporary, and I think that helps growth. You challenge each other, and I think that is another super positive. So after GOTA, we were wandering around, and we went down and started bothering Dave and Mark down at the SSB station. I had signed up, I think, for the either 11 to 12 or 1 to 2 slot in the middle of the night, and so we went down there, and John and I again tag team for a little bit, worked a couple stints, calling and logging for each other and back and forth, and again just had a ton of fun. Met a bunch of other people coming and going, and then I stayed there for quite a bit that night. Working some more calls. And then later in the morning, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, it got really slow, and Dave, grabbed a hold of the computer and popped up FT8 up for me and showed me, a little bit about digital, because I had no idea what that was. So, I learned we just dabbled in it a little bit, but, he was, kind enough to show me a little bit about digital. I had asked the question. He goes, well, yeah, this is how it works. This is, wasn't a tutorial, just a little introduction, and and those were all little things that kind of little steps along the way that got keeping me intrigued in learning. John and I spent a good bit of the night there. We went over to the satellite station, and this was really cool because Daryl was a great guy. Most of y'all know Daryl, K4 RGK. He had the satellite rig there, and he had his big mammoth set up there, and we sat down and he was telling us all about it, and he let me try to make a contact. I thought I was going to make it, but just the guy faded out at the last minute. So, so I almost got my first satellite contact that night, but yeah, just didn't do it. So I couldn't cross that off. Got to do that again. But we stopped by and, I looked over at Steve, but he was too intent to talk to me. No, I'm just messing. Steve was, they were hard at it in the CW tent, so we didn't want to bother them. But and then we, there were so many other pieces and parts of field day that we didn't get to see. So but field day, is I realize now how big a task it is for the club to put on. And it takes so many people. So I appreciate the people that did. I tried to help as little bit as I could. Worked at the Go-To tent and came back that afternoon on Sunday and tried to help put some things away. So that's really important. And it's just great that the club does that. And we obviously need more of the club members to step up and help on that. That's a pretty awesome event and really, really important to new people that are coming up. And I think it's a must-do, for anybody just starting out their ham career. All right, so until now, I'd worked a pretty simple station. I had the FT710, I got a 132-foot wire, and running my 100 watts and having fun, fat, dumb, and happy. And John, gives me a call, goes, hey, I bought a new amplifier. And he had an old one he wanted to move on. He had a Meritron LS 500 M, the 12-volt DC mobile amp with a 10-meter board, so a 500-watt amplifier. And I thought about it. I didn't know if I wanted an amplifier or not. I was doing pretty good. But, and by learning that cadence that I had talked about and understanding, when I had the best chance with the bands and the different times of day and how the propagation was. I was making my DX, but I knew a few more watts it would make it a little bit easier. And that jump from 100 to 400, 450, it made a difference in some of the pileups. Probably I'd say, say the ratio 100%. It took X number of tries or minutes to make a contact with 100 watts, you save about probably 75% of that off with the amplifier. I was making, 3 to 4 to 1 more contacts, that much more quickly during the pileups with the extra wattage. So it was, a good move for me. So by this time I had moved indoors. So. So I got me my timeline folding fiberglass, table here, big time, ham furniture, and still got my little QT60 over on the side, and my Jetstream 32 watt power supply, $89 at that time, $99 at J&L Electronics. Nothing real big dollar here. The biggest thing on the table there is the FT710, AES. But, I knew this was the amplifier was going to change things. I mean, I was going to need a tuner. And I also was going to need to do my antenna, because if you remember way back, that the MFJ was a mid-power on them, and I was going to be having 500 watts now. At 300 watts wasn't going to cut it. May have for a little bit. I was doing SSB, so the power was only at the peaks, but it was only a matter of time before I probably burned that up. So I needed to go ahead and upgrade the antenna, upgrade the 49 to 1. So I bought that stuff, got that ready. John came over, helped me get it set up, and then I'd sat there for a couple of days because I was afraid to turn it on. Okay, John calling me goes, "Have you used that thing yet?" But no, I was afraid to burn something up. Let the magic smoke out. So anyway, I finally turned it on, played with it. went band to band, figuring out how much drive I had to put out the right amount of output that I wanted, before, and experimenting with it, and started using it. But then, so I introduced, found out one of my other mistakes, errors, or whatever you want to talk about, how you want to put it. So that, there's a picture of the Ameritron with the, I went with the LDGAT 1002 tuner, my old guy MFJ SWR bridge, big screen, the 868B, big old 6-inch, watt meter there, and but I start keying around and I'm getting some RF. It wasn't a problem at 100 watts, but I started cranking out near 500, and I started getting some RF. And I knew, I understood common mode, and theoretically I'd passed the test. I understood this, but I hadn't experienced it. So and I was just running two pieces of equipment. That 710 and a power supply. I didn't have a common chassis ground. I was just grounded electrically, to the electrical system at the house. So one of my other ham heroes, Dave, KO4 USA, was talking to him, and he goes, well, you got a couple things. You got RF interference, and you probably also got common mode, which was probably creating the RF interference in the shack. We talked about it, and of course, he asked me about my chassis grounding, and I just played dumb, didn't say anything, I said, because I had not even done anything. So we talked about, well, I need to get a common chassis ground system set up, ground my shack, and then probably, the in-fed half wave, it uses the feed line, as part of the system, but that's also going to allow the common mode into the shack. Okay, so that's what I got. So the first thing we attacked was the common ground, a common chassis ground. Nothing elaborate. Hardware store, some copper wire, a couple of ground clamps, some grounding strap, and some self-tapping sheet metal screws, and a piece of copper pipe. Okay, and there it is. It ain't pretty, but there's my ground bus, with EMT clamps, holding it to the edge of the table underneath there, and then those two later I have another table with the vintage. I had to extend that, but this is it ain't pretty, but it works. So I've got the ground, and then Dave had a 1-to-1 choke ballon y'all built as a team exercise a few years ago. He told me that he wasn't using. So I went ahead and mounted that right to the feed point, right to the bottom of the 49-to-1. And then obviously, now the feed line wasn't being used, so I ran a counterpoise to correct that issue. And we can get, run a counterpoise, don't run a counterpoise, ground the antenna, don't ground the antenna. There's all kind of philosophies. For my particular situation, the way I had my system grounded, and why I had the 1-to-1 right below the feed point, my best, I grounded at first, and SWR was erratic throughout the bands. So I went ahead and just ran a 13-foot 2-inch counterpoise, and that evened me back out. And like every situation is going to be different, but that's the way it worked for me. And the other thing is I had this MFJ window pass-through that I bought very early on. And, we went ahead and put that in and then sealed the window back up. So now I wasn't having to open the window and slide the window down and slide my dang wires in the shack every night, So I was coming up in the world here, So I got my little pass-through here and, the ground system to pass through outside. And we're doing pretty good. So I got to thank Dave for his help with that particular project. So now with the additional power, I was making more DX, and I was wanting to, of course, successful DX contacts, there's a lot of pieces, as you all know. I'm not telling you anything new, but, the physical station conditions, your antenna most paramount, actual band conditions, the band itself, the time of day, all the, propagation patterns as well as weather, time of year, everything. All these come into play. And I was just trying to learn all this stuff, and so I found these websites, Solar Ham. And is this going to blow up if I try to open these up, guys? So, solarham.com, is one of the ones, which is pretty neat because it'll give you the A and the K. It'll give you the I can't work the crack bad. There you go. So to give you the K, it also, he does a little synopsis of what's happening with, potential solar storms, things like that, so you can kind of project ahead a little bit. Now I got to get back to where I was. Okay, all right. And there's spaceweather.com. There's the actual NOAA site. I'm not going to go to them all because I'm going way the hell long. I got to shut up. Solar Ham. And then there's things like, HFDX View and, Prop KC 2, Muff Maps, and then, VOACAP, which is a prediction software based on historical data on in the future what your propagation chances are, based on what's happening and predictors. So these are all tools that I'm learning to use and that are really important for new hams to learn. And then the other things, they're kind of some kind of fun things. It's hfqso.com. It's an activity group, and they start on 17 meters in the afternoon, and it's a group of guys, and you just get together and you log in, and they have a net control, and everybody just takes their turn. This is KQ4 PCR, who hears me? And then you get real live, signal reports from everybody that's checked in. And they got guys checking in from New Zealand, from Australia, American Samoa, Canada, Washington. They're a good spread of check-ins. And if you make an antenna change or a system change, it's a fun live way to check it out. And then they go from band to band to band, and you just follow them down the bands. So it's kind of fun. HFQSO. And that link, yeah, it did work. Okay. So it's another, pretty cool, pretty cool tool that I like. Let me get back. Okay. All right. So all these will, help broaden your knowledge and increase your DX count, And then obviously the next thing is spotting, and I didn't really know anything about spotting, and except for I had used the spot list on POTA, but I hadn't really put two together, use it for myself or use it for DX. And the one, there's a bunch of them. The one I'm particularly fond of, DX Summit, is the one I use. So with all the contacts, you need to keep track of everything. So I needed a better logging software. So that was my next quest. My next quest is, was what am I going to do with logging software? Another sticky wicket. Everybody has a favorite, and and there's full-blown suites like Ham Radio Deluxe to really simple programs, and like I said, right now at the time I was using QRZ.com as my logging and my confirmation software. But, I looked around, and I settled on N3FJP.com, which is a suite. They've got AC Log, which is their logging software, and they have rig control, and they have DX spotting, and then they have contest software. So, they had pretty much everything I was looking for. And the DX spotting was pretty cool because it's configurable. You can narrow it down to just, spots, from, your country, your continent. You don't want to particularly chase something that's been spotted in Australia. You might be able to pick it up, or, somebody that spotted somebody from Germany, You want some, look at the spots from your local area. So you can configure that. It hooks into your software to where it'll tell you if a country is spotted that you don't have, you can enable that, and it'll say, hey, new country, and tell you what band it's on. So there's all kind of aids here. It's almost like cheating, to try to get your DX100, but I was on that quest, so I wanted to use every tool that I could. So I like it. It's a lot of fun. And it's also got rig control, and it interfaces with QRZ. So, I could pick up on something, click on somebody, and from AC log, open up the QRZ page and see who I was talking again. I didn't have to get out, get in and out, get in and out. It was all integrated. So, it was a lot of fun. And like I said, they've got, I'm not going to click on the link to speed things up, but this is kind of what it looks like, okay. My QSO's up top, at the bottom, the DX spotter, and then over on the right-hand side, the band map. And then, with rig control enabled, I can click on any one of those. I could click down here on the Canary Island one on 14205, and it's going to tune my rig to 14205, start filling out the log. I can make the contact and move on. So it's really, this is probably nothing new to most of y'all, but this was like, wow, pretty cool for a new guy, And then, like I said, they've also got contest software. And something that I've done recently, since this was put together, I've entered a couple contests. This was the first one. This was the CQ WPX SSB DX contest about a month ago. And then, as you can see, it's got the spots down there. It tells me, there's one I haven't gotten yet. And then, I can click on it up there, and, it'll take me to the band, set it in the right mode, and start filling out the log, which, is pretty slick. So that kind of, goes through, getting my first radio, getting my second radio, getting my first antenna, my second radio antenna, my amplifier, shack problems, new antenna, and so I'm still looking for something else. So, I'm going to buy me a new toy, an antenna analyzer, okay? I bought, this Rig Expert AA230. Of course, a lot of y'all, use the Nano NVAs, Lee's already done a couple of really nice presentations on those, which, do more than just analyze antennas, but I had bought this antennalizer, and this thing was, I killed the batteries in this thing in about 3 days, okay? I was checking my SWR about 8 ways from Sunday when it was 40 degrees, when it was 80 degrees, when the sun was out, when it was dark, when the antenna, extraction and, I'm doing all kind of weird stuff. I deliberately took some old cable and put a nick in it so I could figure out where the cut in the cable was. You can do all kind of things with one of these tools, So this opened up a whole new thing for me and a new gadget to play with. And more, in my mind, fun in the hobby, which is what I was after, So we used this, John came over and I abused him for a day, lengthening and shortening the antenna, lengthening and shortening the antenna, until we, dialed that in-fed half wave, as good as we can get it, below 1.5 on just about every dang band, so I was saying that was pretty cool. And the dips are where I want to operate, and since I'm SSB at the moment, my dips are in the SSB and the voice portion. They're not in the data sections of the bands, so we were trying to make that compromise because, you're going to shift one, you're going to shift the other, and we had to make the compromise to get the dips as close as I could to where I wanted to operate on every one of the bands. Just another way to use the tool, the knowledge that I got in studying for the exams, and put them into, practice and improving my situation. So, I thought that was pretty cool. So a little bit later, a thunderstorm come through and, brought my antenna down. And then, so I needed some help again. And this is, another ham hero, Mark, WA1 NIP. Dave's already been helped. I'm abusing him again. Say, hey, Dave, need your help again. So I got me some Dacron rope and the pulleys and some more insulators. And, they came back up, and we put it back up a little better this time, with one line to pull the antenna up and down, but another to raise and lower it, So it would be, I could raise and lower, it a lot easier. And then, of course, me going out there, let's shorten it another couple of inches. Let's shorten it a couple of other inches. And of course, they're, going like, Don, it doesn't really matter. I'm getting to a point where I'm really wasting my time. But, I've still got to learn this stuff, So, sorry, sorry you guys, but we had fun. So Dave came over with his gun, to shoot that back up. And, of course, I think the first time he shot it over into the house next door. But, but nobody was home, so it was all cool. And then, of course, and here's, me, no, a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, when they're on the far side of the yard, and I'm sitting, at the entrance to the shack with the AA 230, doing the bands. But anyway, we had fun, and we dialed that puppy in, 20 meters, 1.13. Right where I want to operate, so I'm saying that's pretty cool. We'll squint while we're ahead. So the next thing, I've learned a lot. I made some mistakes, I've had some victories, but and made a lot of great friends. It says some here, but I made a lot. But I still, got the itch. I'd be sitting there, calling the X or looking or chasing, and then I'd see New Guinea, and I start going over there and I go, out of privilege, man. Dang, So, I knew that I needed, to take the next step. So, it's time, it was extra time. So, back to the ARR manual, and this time I combined the manual with ham radio prep software. And between, working through the workbook, answering the questions at the end of the workbook, taking the practice test and ham radio prep, and again, like I said, I'm kind of visual and read. So I was reading, I was watching the videos in ham radio prep, taking the quizzes and the exams, and that's what worked for me. And, when I was happy with my success rate on the practice exams, got a hold of Ian and registered and, took my exam over there at Slopes. And luckily, I passed because I think they would have thrown me out if I hadn't. I was pretty excited about that. So, I was, I was extra. I was pretty psyched about it. I talked earlier about QSL cards. I know it's an older thing. It's a dying thing. Maybe it's not dying. It's not as prevalent as it once was. Let's put it that way. But that's part of the allure of ham radio was always to me. QSL cards. That was something. My uncle's QSL cards on the wall. That was something I wanted. So you get it handmade, printed. You can, however you want. I chose to have mine made by a gentleman, KB3. IFH QSL cards, and I ordered some, and I've been sending and receiving ever since, and I didn't make a fancy card, just a real simple one, but on good card stock, and then of course like I said, I got them. This I just picked a couple, Seychelles, island nation just north of Madagascar, off the east coast of Africa. Okay, and this is San Andres. An island nation north of Santa Lucia. And then, from myriad points in between. I mean, one of the really cool things is, checking the mail every day and seeing if a new one comes in. I usually send out about 1 or 2 a week. And, and then they usually dribble in about the same time, sometimes 6, 7 months afterwards, something from Suriname or French New Guinea, or the one from the Seychelles, I think took 6 months to get here. So it's really cool. Sometimes you forget about the contact and the card shows up, and that's pretty neat. So I'm working, chasing DX. I'm calling CQ. I'm playing with my cards. I'm working the local repeaters, and then Mark WA1IP becomes a little more of a factor in my ham radio journey. You know, he calls a net on Saturday nights on 40 meters. You know, he talked about it at lunch a few times. And, you know, my experience with nets to that point were contact nets, you know, like 3905 Century Club, you know, the 1010 International, OMIS, but mainly the 3905 Century Club, because those QSOs are confirmed by card. And like I said, I'm a card guy. So every contact you make on that, you send a card and receive a card back. There's no electronic confirmation, you know, on that particular group. You know, so when you reach their award levels, it's pretty neat because you have to submit the cards just like old school, get them, you know, signed off and everything. It's pretty neat. But he was, you know, he's on a rag chew net. I said, well, you know, sometimes I'm trying to make contacts. Sometimes when I'm calling CQ, I'm talking to folks. I'm kind of a little bit of both. And so I listened to the net a few times, and I found out they had a vintage radio net night. That was Sunday night, where everybody checks in on their old tube radios, man. And now I've gotten flashbacks to my uncle and his old Heathkit radios, you know, Benton Harbor Green, okay? And so I said, yeah. So I'm listening to the vintage net, you know, 2 or 3 times, and you know, kind of getting the itch again. You know, I always knew that I wanted to get something vintage. You know, I don't know if I was ready for it yet in my career. You know, but the vintage net, you know, it set the hook. You know, so talking to Mark a few more times, you know, they were, you know, any net, if anybody's been around a long time, knows that they struggle to get help. People to call the nets, people to log, people things do like that. They had a fellow get sick and they needed some loggers. They used net logger software, you know, so I said, yeah, you know, I'll learn how to do the software and step in a little bit, and when somebody's sick, you know, log for you. You know, so, you know, I say here I succumbed to Mark's pressuring. He wasn't really pressuring me, but you know, I wanted to tease him a little bit. But, you know, we got to working with another ham, a AA4 JG, fellow named Jeff in Chattanooga. Actually went and sold him a piece of Drake equipment yesterday. So it was pretty neat to actually go and meet him. Mark and I went up to Chattanooga, you know, the other day. But I learned how to do that. I started helping Mark on Saturday nights. And then, you know, fast forward, you know, and here comes this cruise again. You know, Don, what do you think about calling a net? They didn't have a Wednesday night guy. And, you know, so I said, I don't know. And then, you know, we talked about a few more things. And you know, I said, okay, you know, I'll give it a shot. And Wednesday night, it's the middle of the week. They had very few check-ins. You know, it'd just be like calling CQ, I figured, you know, well, I was wrong. I mean, but I didn't know that yet. So March 15th, 2025, Wednesday night, you know, I go live as a net control operator, the net control station for the Moonlighters on 271. But we put a little twist in it. And I had just put online fully refreshed Heathkit station, an SB102 and SB220 with the EV638 microphone, the SB600 speaker, the 23B power supply. Numbers you'd make no sense to y'all unless you're a Heathkit nut, and that man is right there. You know, the EV638 is really the HDP23A 21A microphone. So anyway, so all 1971 vintage stuff from a one silent key. And this is where, you know, John came in. John was approached by a gentleman that wanted to sell that at the Hamfest for his deceased father-in-law. You know, it had been stored for 25 years in his garage. And, you know, I think Dave went over to help John pick it up. And, you know, Dave saw that it was a Heathkit called Mark. Mark knew I was in the market, and Mark called me, and, you know, bingo, I'm writing a check, for some that hadn't been on the air for 25, 26 years, okay? You know, taking a leap of faith. But it really did look pretty good shape. Opened it up, and it looked pretty good. But anyway, we got it running, and I called that first net because the conditions were perfect. No noise, because, you know, there's no noise suppression on these old radios. So you have to have pretty good, to make it to work a net when you have 40 some odd check-ins all over the country. You know, so, but it worked well. I called that first net that night, you know, on a 50 some odd year tube radio, and I thought that was just, you know, really, really super cool. So that, I enjoyed the heck out of it. I really liked it. The second week, wasn't so grand. Bad band conditions. People couldn't hear each other. They couldn't hear me. And this is where I learned what, net control is all about. And I don't claim to, to put myself in the league of some of you Aries folks or racy folks or those kind of people. But you probably understand what I'm saying here. You have to know where your assets are. And mine, the assets were relay stations, where I would take a pick and know this gentleman would be able to bring that gentleman in and keep the net flowing. So I had to utilize 5 relay stations that night and over the 2.5-hour period of the net, but it worked. I got a little flustered, a little tongue-tied at the beginning. Mark texted me and said, "You got it," and worked through the process. And it was another little challenge, learn to use other stations to relay the other stations in and keep the net flowing seamlessly. And it really may seem like a little thing, but if you've try it. It's a little bit of a challenge, and I was real proud of how it worked out. And I can understand how being a net control operator, can improve your operating skills. So that's another thing I would say for somebody to, try it, man. Give it a whirl. So it's just another part of ham radio, that I've been privileged to experience, and in a way for me to give back, a little bit. So my next jump is kit building. I bought this baby down at Hamcation in Orlando. This is a WC4 MCM, a guy named Don Friend. He puts this SWR bridge and power meter in a kit form. It's a little bitty one on top of my blind guy MFJ there. And it was a great little kit. And David built one. He told me, look, it's just like putting your heath kit together. The manual was exactly like that, step by step by step. So I bought that and went up to Dave's shack because he had a better soldering station than I did and other things in case we needed them. And we spent a Tuesday or Wednesday, I can't remember, and put it together, and it worked. So one little problem with one LED, and it didn't light up. And we could adjust it, but Dave opened it up and went back through several of my solder joints. We tested the LED, it checked out right. We tested the resistor, it checked out right. We tested the FET, it checked out. Everything checked right, but it still wasn't lighting up. He just went through and checked a couple of my solder joints, and there obviously was one I probably pulled off a little too soon and didn't make a good solder joint. Had probably a cold joint in there. And that was it. And then we calibrated it and went to town. And it was another win, in my little fledgling career. And that was it was really cool. So, now, and you were saying, I know this guy's done. So tech, general, extra. I'm active on HF and UHF, VHF. Part of a dynamic club. 156 DX entities right now, all on voice. Worked all states. Bunch of other, QRZ things. Master of North America, Europe, South America, Africa, whatever. And worked all 50 POTA states, or POTA parks in all 50 states, and I think 38 DX. POTA parks, and then a net control logger, and net control station, and logging, and it's been a super a fun ride. I've also made a few changes to the station. Since then I bought a FT DX10. For the shack, the FT710 now is going to reside in my fifth wheel, so I don't have to take the radio back and forth when we travel. And I got a little more amplification, a nice little Mercury 3 amplifier to go with that FT DX10, and I've entered a couple of contests, so That's been a year and 1 month. But I've got, like I said, so much more to do. Go back to the beginning, that little bullet point and that whole page. I'm still at that little bullet point. I got so much more to learn. I don't have, FT8. Okay, I just dabbled in it. I want to learn code. I bought a. Steve laughed at me when I showed it to him, but I bought an old Heathkit keyer. An expert probably can't get more than 10 words a minute out of that thing. It's so cumbersome, but it was, obviously I'm not going to do any blazing speed with it, but, it matches my Heathkit stuff, and I got it at Hamcation, so I do have a keyer, to do CW. I haven't done any 6 meter, I haven't done any moon bounce, and, there's just all kind of stuff, I still haven't made my first satellite contact. So a bunch of things left to do. But the biggest thing, that I got that I'm most proud of, my favorite radio, the first one I turn on when I go down to the shack, and here's where I got to thank Mark with his help with this project. His love of the hobby and vintage radios, is infectious, and his patience and attention to detail with me, and I've learned a lot from him, and I can't thank you enough for that, Mark. And he's the big reason why the station's on the air today. And that is this beauty here, and that it looks brand new. If you go to my QRZ page and you'll see it, it looks brand new. The chrome inlays and the dials have been polished. Okay. And the only thing now, I should have got a newer picture because that Drake MN2000 is gone. There's now a Heathkit SA2060 up there, so it's now totally Heathkit. And I got to thank Wes for that. Where's Wes? Because Wes turned me on to the SA2060 to complete my Heathkit station there. So, that is really, really cool. I've called, like I said, I called net on it. I chased the X on it. Haven't tried the contest on it. That'd be pretty cumbersome having to dial and tune when I change bands. But if you get on some Wednesday night or some Sunday night, or you catch me on the radio, most often probably I'll be on this, and I'll guarantee you can't tell it from a modern radio. This thing is sweet. It's a really good setup, and that was when Mark and we brought it over and put it on the air for the first time at my shack. So Mark, I can't, like I said, I can't thank you enough. So guys, that's it. That's a year in a life. Thanks. My gosh, I talked too long. Yes, sir.
One question and two observations. Why would you not disconnect your antenna?
Why would I not?
Yes, why would you, is it on? Why would you not? You made a comment, you no longer have to disconnect.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Before I had the pass through, I had to disconnect the antenna to shut the window.
Okay. There's an old adage that lightning never strikes twice in the same place. That's BS. Once is enough.
There you go.
And two observations that may be of value to you. There's a software called PSK Reporter.
Yes.
PSK Reporter will tell you within 30 seconds of you keying up and calling CQ, people all over the world who are hearing you. So that's a valuable software. When it comes to spotting networks, there's a very good one from Lee Sawkins, BE7CC.
BE7CC?
Right, and I can fill you in on that later. The reason I suggest that is you can tailor it, because when you're using a regular spotting network and there's a station in Germany or Finland that's saying he's copying so-and-so, you're probably not going to hear them. But you can tailor, in my case, I have the spots North America, Canada, and Mexico.
Yeah.
and there's a good chance if that's a station that I'm looking for, I'll be able to hear them. So it's something to
No, I
consider.
appreciate it. Thank you, Neil. Yeah,
You're
that's good.
welcome.
Yeah, because, like you said, I don't want a spot from somebody in Germany because chances are, a good chance I might not be able to get him. So excellent, excellent. Thanks a bunch. Appreciate it.
Any other
That way,
questions?
okay.
Any other
You're
questions?
shooing me over here.
Do we have any questions from anybody in the audience online?
Too long.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. I think they did too. Okay?
Hey, come on back. Come back here.
Thank you, Ron.
All right, thanks.
Okay?
All right, guys, I'm sorry it was so long.
You earned that one. Okay?
Thanks, guys.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Don. That was great. And I hope you guys all enjoyed it, because I did. What else should you do this evening? Well, we're going to end the video, right? So thank you very much.
Long path JA in Europe calling CQDX, standing by. Here, an Echo India 2.